We've got Solange Mougin on the set today for a review of today's papers. Hi, Solange. The big story for everyone, it seems, is Boris Johnson and that move to suspend Parliament for a month before the Brexit deadline.
Yeah, and today's headline of the Times of London is Johnson goes for broke, which personally I think is quite interesting because it's comparatively neutral or even kind to Johnson compared to the language used in some of the other papers. Now, The Guardian focused on, quote, the outrage that's being expressed by the opposition, by the Remainers, and even by the head of the House of Commons, who called the prorogation a constitutional outrage. Equally eye-catching, but pictureless. The Independent went with the very sober front page. It even looks kind of like a chapter from British history, from a history book. It says that suspending Parliament was Johnson's coup that denies voters the final say and silences their representatives.
And you started there with the Times saying that Johnson was going for broke, and that notion of gambling is also being picked up by the foreign press.
Yeah, the Australian academic site The Conversation actually asks a game theorist to weigh in on Johnson's political move. The article says that Johnson knows that talk is cheap and that action, like parliamentary suspension, is needed to establish credibility in negotiating. And it goes through how Johnson is trying to paint a picture of himself as credible and as strong, all the while adding a bit of madness or unpredictability to create fear in Brussels.
Now, here in France, it seems like Johnson's suspension of Parliament means a no-deal Brexit is inevitable.
Yeah, for Libération, Brexit has become harder and harder. Yesterday was not a, quote, common day in the House of Commons. Libération, always great for the wordplays. Anyway, La Croix also refers to what they call as Johnson's sort of magic trick, that he's not only surprised everyone, but he's also shown how ready he is to risk making British democracy weaker by sidelining Parliament.
And the notion of British democracy being under siege is coming up in the U.S. press as well.
Yeah, the American site, The Atlantic, says, it's also a magazine, they say the temporary suspension of Parliament is, quote, the most dangerous assault on British institutions in living memory. That Johnson is indeed trying to stop British institutions from deciding on, quote, the enormously important issues like Brexit. Now, the Washington Post goes a bit further and draws parallels between the political turmoil in the UK with the US. It says in both countries you have, quote, ruthless executives pushing the bounds of the Constitution, ruling parties that fear for their electoral future and thus use political slogans to undermine institutions. And when it comes to the nation's opposition, you have deep divisions and no strong populist leader on the opposition side. Now, that's from the Washington Post. And they conclude that there is irony here, that both nations were seeking to reclaim sovereignty or power, and in doing so, they've actually made themselves weaker.
All right, let's stay in the U.S. A different subject, though. Cyber warfare. The New York Times says the U.S. was behind a secret cyber attack against Iran this summer.
Yeah, the Times says that they've got it from American officials, senior American officials. They've confirmed that on June 20th, the U.S. successfully wiped out a critical Iranian database used by the Iranian paramilitary. Now, the officials say the cyber attack was more successful than they'd hoped, as Iran is still trying to recover the information that they lost. Information that was being used by Iran to target shipping traffic in the Gulf. But the Times says that cyber attacks have also created much debate within the government because such attacks give up precious intelligence about the U.S.'s cyber capabilities, and it also wipes out the U.S.'s secret access to the servers once the attack takes place.
So these debates about the pros and cons of cyber warfare, cyber attacks, lead to even more questions about just how nations use their spying capabilities.
Yeah, and in this week's New Yorker magazine, Adam Gopnik wonders whether spying is actually really worth it. He asks whether countries he asks whether countries that have successful spying operations are actually successful nations. And he argues that, quote, there is a paranoid paradox of espionage, that the better your intelligence, the dumber your conduct. The more you know, the less you anticipate, end quote.
Solange, let's just wrap up now with something very strange, some strange medical news about werewolf syndrome.
Yeah, this is actually a little bit disturbing, but I promise there is a happy ending. More than a dozen babies were given over-the-counter heartburn or colic medication in Spain, and then they began to have strange symptoms, namely a massive amount of hair growing on their faces and foreheads and bodies. Poor things, which is werewolf syndrome. Well, the doctors figured out that the heartburn medication was actually mislabeled, and it was actually of medicine to stop hair loss, kind of like Rogaine, for say balding men. Anyway, the good news is the kids will be fine. That once you stop taking the medication, the temporary werewolf syndrome goes away.
I guess it'll make for some great pictures when you're older,
Yes.
but still, read your labels, people. All right, Solange, thank you for that. Solange Moujon there with that look at the press review. Don't forget, you can always get a closer look at the press review on our website. The address is france24.com.